February 3, 2023, a decision was made. A mother boarded a plane from Ohio. A toddler was left behind alone for 8 days. Zoe Mercer and the world moved on. Drinks were poured, music blasted, freedom wrapped around Lydia like a blanket. But somewhere far away, behind that locked door, something was happening. Something no one knew, something no one could imagine. Lydia Mercer laughed under hotel lights, drank expensive cocktails, and reveled in a world of indulgence, while 2-year-old Zoe lay alone in a dark Ohio apartment, crying for a mother who wouldn't come, reaching for comfort that wasn't there, her tiny voice growing weaker with each passing hour. The weight of abandonment settling over a child too young to understand why mommy had vanished. How cold does a mother have to be to do something like this? How could she wake up each day, day 1, day 2, day 3, drinking, dancing, taking selfies, and never once feel the ache for her child? The steady ticking of time passing, the slow emptying of a sippy cup, the growing hunger in a toddler's belly, the desperate cries that eventually fell silent. She could have taken Zoe to a friend, a neighbor, a relative's home, anyone, but she didn't. She locked the door, walked away, and never looked back. The choice made in a moment of selfish desire echoed through empty rooms where a child waited, hope fading with each sunset and sunrise. The calendar pages turned. February 4th, Zoe called out for her mother. February 5th, the food was gone. February 6th, thirst took over. February 7th, neighbors heard crying. February 8th, the crying stopped. February 9th, silence filled the apartment. February 10th, the smell began to seep into the hallway. She could have made a different choice, a phone call, a text message, a moment of thought for the life she created. But she didn't. And by the time someone finally knocked on that door, it was already too late. What makes a mother abandon her child? Is it selfishness? Desperation? Or something much darker? Before the flight, before the partying, before she walked out and left her child alone, let's go back to how it all started. The story of Lydia Mercer didn't begin with abandonment. It began like many tragedies do, with hope, with dreams, with wounds too deep to see. A woman searching for something she never had, running from demons that followed her from childhood, making choices that seemed small until they weren't. And Zoe, innocent, trusting, loving Zoe, caught in the undertow of her mother's broken life, would become a statistic, a headline, a cautionary tale. A child who deserved protection but received abandonment. A life with potential cut short by the very person meant to nurture it. This is their story. This is how a mother's choice to board a plane became a death sentence for her child. This is how 8 days of freedom cost a lifetime of possibility. Her name was Lydia Mercer, 32 years old. A woman who craved the one thing that had always eluded her, real love. Not the fleeting kind that disappeared by morning, not the conditional type that required constant performance, but something lasting, something true. Born and raised in Columbus, Ohio, her childhood was anything but stable. Her mother, a woman battling her own demons, was in and out of prison by the time Lydia was 6. The system took over after that, and Lydia was shuffled between foster homes. Different faces, different rules, different levels of indifference or cruelty. By the time she was 10, Lydia had lived in 7 different homes. Some were cold, some were crowded, none felt like they belonged to her. In one home, she shared a bedroom with 3 other girls. In another, she slept on a pull-out couch in the living room. Once, for 8 glorious months, she lived with a couple who seemed to care, who asked about her day, who hung her drawings on the refrigerator. But then the husband lost his job, and they couldn't afford another mouth to feed. Back into the system she went, learning the lesson that would define her life. Nothing good ever lasts. She learned early that attention was currency. If no one was going to love her for who she was, then she would make sure they noticed her for what she did. In middle school, she was the girl who wore makeup before anyone else, who knew how to make the boys stare. By high school, she had perfected the art of being wanted, at least temporarily. She became whatever the person in front of her seemed to need. Wild for the rebels, sweet for the shy ones, ambitious for those headed somewhere. She could read people quickly, figure out the shape of their desires, and pour herself into that mold. "You're like a chameleon," her 11th grade boyfriend told her. He meant it as a compliment. She took it as survival strategy. In high school, Lydia searched for belonging through relationships. She fell hard and fast for boys who couldn't possibly give her what she needed. There was Matt, the football player who only called after midnight. There was Derek, who borrowed money he never returned. There was Jason, who made her feel special until she discovered she was one of 3 girls who felt that way. Each relationship began with promise and ended with emptiness, but Lydia never stopped believing the next one would be different. College was a brief attempt at something stable. She enrolled at Ohio State, undeclared major, vague dreams. The structure, the responsibility, the daily grind of lectures and papers, it all felt suffocating to someone who had spent her life adapting moment by moment. She dropped out after 3 semesters, seeing no future in it, feeling like she was playing at someone else's life. There were easier ways to make it, faster ways to feel fulfilled. The pattern continued through her 20s. Bartending jobs she quit when managers got too demanding. Apartments she left when roommates became too familiar. And always, men who promised the world but delivered only moments of affection followed by days of absence. Each time she convinced herself this one was different. Each time she was wrong. "You expect too much," her friend Tanya told her once, after a particularly painful breakup with a man who had sworn he was leaving his wife. "Nobody can fill that hole inside you, Lydia." But Lydia didn't believe that. Because if it were true, then what was the point of any of it? At 29, she met Chris. He was older, confident, with a steady job and a smile that seemed sincere. For 3 months, Lydia felt like maybe, just maybe, she had found something real. They moved in together quickly. Too quickly, her few friends warned, but Lydia didn't listen. When had caution ever brought her happiness? The pregnancy was unexpected. Chris's smile faltered when she told him, but he recovered quickly. "We'll figure it out," he said, kissing her forehead. 3 weeks later, he was gone. A note on the kitchen counter, his clothes missing from the closet, his number already disconnected. Alone again, but not really alone anymore. A life growing inside her, dependent on her in ways she could barely comprehend. Initially, Lydia hoped motherhood would bring what had always eluded her: unconditional love, purpose, a bone-deep connection to another human being. She decorated the nursery with yard sale finds, sang to her swelling belly, made promises in the dark about the kind of mother she would be. Zoe came into the world on a rainy Tuesday in April. 6 pounds, 4 ounces. A shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to hold questions Lydia couldn't answer. Reality hit hard. The sleepless nights. The constant crying. The isolation. Motherhood wasn't the beautiful escape Lydia had imagined during pregnancy. It was exhaustion. It was responsibility. It was a weight she had never prepared to carry. "It gets easier," the nurses assured her. "You'll adjust," her doctor promised. "It's all worth it," strangers in the grocery store insisted. But for Lydia, the adjustment never came. The worth remained theoretical. She went through the motions, feeding, changing, bathing, but the connection, that flood of maternal love she had been promised, arrived only in brief moments that were quickly washed away by the tide of resentment. She loved Zoe. In her way, in moments, she did. But deep down, in the honest parts of herself she rarely acknowledged, she saw her daughter as a burden. Another anchor in a life that had always felt like drowning. As Zoe grew from infant to toddler, Lydia's resentment grew alongside her. Each milestone, first steps, first words, should have been cause for celebration. Instead, they only marked time passing, opportunities slipping away, youth fading while she was trapped in a small apartment with a child who needed things she didn't know how to give. Lydia started going out when she could afford a babysitter. Nights at bars where she could pretend, for a few hours, that she was still the girl she used to be. Men still looked at her, still wanted her, still made promises. She collected their phone numbers like talismans, reminders that she was more than just someone's mother. The drinking started as social, became habitual, edged toward necessary. A glass of wine after Zoe went to bed. 2 glasses. A bottle. It dulled the edges of her discontent, softened the sharp corners of her regret. By the time Zoe was 2, Lydia had mastered the art of functional motherhood, keeping her daughter fed, clothed, and physically safe while emotionally retreating further and further into herself. Her phone became her lifeline, a portal to the world she wished she inhabited instead of the one she actually did. That's when the messages from Elijah began. Simple at first. Flattering. Attentive. A like on a photo. A comment about her smile. Nothing spectacular, just the ordinary currency of online interaction. But to Lydia, starved for attention, for escape, for the feeling that she mattered to someone, these small validations were everything. She never imagined where they would lead. Never thought she could make the choice she eventually would. Never believed she was capable of walking away. But then again, Lydia Mercer had spent her entire life walking away from things. From college, from jobs, from apartments, from relationships. In the end, perhaps it wasn't so surprising that she could walk away from her child too. What was surprising was that she never walked back. What makes a man powerful? Is it money, status, or the ability to make people believe he is something he's not? For Elijah Frost, power wasn't about what he had, it was about perception. At just 20 years old, he had already mastered the art of illusion, creating a reality that existed only in carefully filtered photos and exaggerated stories. Elijah grew up in a small apartment on the east side of Cleveland, raised by his grandmother after his mother disappeared into the haze of addiction when he was 7. His father was never in the picture, just a name his mother sometimes cursed when the rent was late or the electricity got shut off. His grandmother did her best, working 2 jobs well into her 70s. Arthritis gnarling her hands as she cleaned other people's houses and worked night shifts at a 24-hour diner. Every day, young Elijah watched her leave before dawn and return after dark, her body stooped with exhaustion, her purse containing barely enough to keep them afloat. He made a promise to himself early. He would never work that hard for so little. There had to be easier ways to get what he wanted. Deception became his shortcut to success. It started small, the way these things often do. In middle school, he sold counterfeit concert tickets to classmates. In high school, he mastered the art of returning items he'd never purchased to department stores. Small scams, quick cash, no real harm done. At least that's what he told himself as he pocketed money that wasn't his. By 18, Elijah had graduated to credit card fraud. He'd find discarded receipts, call the stores posing as the customer, claim an item hadn't been delivered, and request refunds to different accounts. He had a gift for voices, for sounding sincere, for making people trust him over the phone. The money wasn't life-changing, but it was easier than working, and the thrill of getting away with it became its own reward. At 19, he discovered a new frontier, online manipulation. With nothing but a smartphone and a silver tongue, he could become anyone he wanted. He created profiles with borrowed photos, invented backstories about being a young entrepreneur, a music producer, a talent scout. His targets weren't wealthy. He preferred regular women who were lonely, who were looking for something just beyond their reach. Women like Lydia Mercer. Their meeting wasn't dramatic, no elaborate scheme, no calculated targeting. Just a casual comment on a photo she posted of herself at a local bar, glass of wine in hand, forced smile not quite reaching her eyes. "You look like you could use better company," he wrote. 4 hours later, she replied, "You offering?" From that first interaction, Elijah recognized something in Lydia, a hunger that matched his own. Not for money, necessarily, but for escape, for something that felt like meaning. He studied her profile before responding, noted the absence of a father in her daughter's photos, saw the trying too hard outfits and the eyes that never quite looked happy. She was perfect. He was charming, attentive, everything she craved. He responded quickly to her messages, asked questions about her day, remembered details she mentioned in passing. "You told me last week that Mexican food is your favorite," he'd say, sending her a picture of tacos from an upscale restaurant she couldn't afford. "Wish you were here to share these with me." They messaged late into the night, exchanged sweet nothings that felt real. While Zoe slept in the next room, Lydia's phone lit up with promises that pulled her further and further from her reality. Elijah knew exactly what to say, how to make her feel seen in ways she hadn't in years, perhaps ever. "I can't stop thinking about you," he'd write at 2 a.m. "I've never connected with someone like this," he'd claim after a week of texting. "You're different from other women," he'd insist, though he sent similar messages to 3 others that same night. The fantasy he sold wasn't elaborate. He didn't claim to be a millionaire or a celebrity. He was smart enough to keep his lies within the realm of possibility. A young man with a growing business, with connections in the entertainment industry, with just enough success to have disposable income but not enough to raise serious questions. "I'm doing well, but I'm just getting started," he told her, vague enough that she could fill in the blanks with her own imagination. "I've got big things coming. I just need the right people around me." Elijah made her feel special, chosen. In a life where Lydia had always been abandoned, this sense of being selected was intoxicating. He sent her screenshots of expensive watches he claimed to be considering buying, asked her opinion on luxury cars he had no intention of purchasing, discussed vacations to places he'd only seen on Instagram. "You deserve more than what you've settled for," he told her one night when she confessed how trapped she felt. "Someone like you shouldn't be struggling. You should be spoiled, taken care of." "I want to spoil you," he promised. "I want to show you how a woman like you should be treated." She let herself believe him because she wanted to. Because believing in Elijah was easier than facing another day of the life she actually had. Because his words filled a void that had been empty for so long she'd forgotten what it was like to feel full. When he finally suggested they meet in person, Lydia didn't hesitate. The reality that her online salvation was barely out of his teens, that his business existed only in conversation, that the lifestyle he projected was funded by fraud and deception, none of this occurred to her. Or if it did, she pushed the thoughts aside. Even unconsciously. Perhaps some part of Lydia recognized in Elijah a fellow escape artist, someone else who had learned to run from reality rather than face it. 2 people skilled at reinvention, at becoming whatever was needed in the moment to get what they wanted. Neither of them considered, even for a moment, what this connection might cost. Neither imagined that their mutual fantasy would end with a child dying alone in a locked apartment, with headlines splashed across newspapers, with prison sentences and a legacy of tragedy. They were just 2 people reaching for something beyond their grasp, unaware or uncaring of what they might knock over in the process. By late January 2023, Lydia's life had narrowed to a single point of focus: her phone and the messages from Elijah that made everything else fade away. She checked for his texts constantly, while feeding Zoe, while the toddler napped, during her shifts at the convenience store, in the middle of the night. The blue light of her screen illuminated her face as she lay awake, rereading their conversations, analyzing his words, looking for deeper meanings in every "miss you" and "thinking of you." When Zoe cried for attention, Lydia felt a flash of irritation. When her boss asked her to work extra shifts, she saw it only as time away from her phone. Her few remaining friends stopped calling. Her apartment grew messier. Bills piled up unopened. None of it mattered as long as Elijah kept messaging, kept promising, kept feeding the fantasy that had become more real to her than her actual life. February 2nd, 2023. The notification lit up her phone while she was giving Zoe a hasty bath. Her heart jumped in her chest, the Pavlovian response to Elijah's name on her screen now automatic, physical. "Come see me," he wrote. "Tomorrow. I miss your face." 3 simple phrases that shattered what little responsibility remained in Lydia's mind. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask how long he expected her to stay, didn't question how she would afford the trip or who would watch Zoe. The only thing that mattered was that he had asked, and that she would not disappoint him. "I'll be there," she replied instantly, her thumbs moving faster than her thoughts. She added a heart emoji, then deleted it, then added it again. She spent the evening in a frenzy of preparation. What to wear, what to pack, how to look her best. She tried on outfits and posed in the bathroom mirror, abandoned Zoe's dinner half prepared when Elijah sent another message. The child fussed in her high chair, but Lydia barely heard it, lost in the thrill of escape, of being wanted. For a brief moment, as she was zipping her overnight bag, she considered Zoe. But only briefly. The logistics of finding someone to watch her daughter presented an obstacle to what Lydia had already decided was happening. Her mother was long gone, no siblings to call, friends had drifted away, put off by her increasing self-absorption. Arranging childcare meant explanations, judgment, maybe even people saying no. "I'll be back before anyone notices," she rationalized, the lie slipping easily into her consciousness. Just a weekend away. 2 days, 3 at most. Instead of arranging care, she went to the kitchen and pulled out whatever required no preparation. A box of crackers, some fruit snacks, a few granola bars. She left them on the counter where Zoe could see them, filled a sippy cup with juice and placed it next to the snacks. "A 2-year-old doesn't eat much, right?" she murmured to herself, wiping her hands on her dress and returning to her packing. The thought fluttered briefly through her mind that Zoe couldn't reach the counter, couldn't open the packages without help, couldn't refill the cup when it emptied. But she pushed the thought away as quickly as it came. Inconvenient realities had no place in the story she was telling herself. February 3rd, 2023, 5:30 a.m. The sky outside was still dark as Lydia stood at the door, overnight bag beside her, purse clutched in her hand. She'd ordered a rideshare that would arrive any minute. Her hair was carefully styled, makeup applied with precision, the outfit chosen to highlight every curve. She looked nothing like a mother. That was intentional. Behind her, in the dim light of the apartment's nightlight, Zoe was awake. Not crying, not fussing, just watching with an eerie calmness that might have disturbed Lydia had she bothered to really look. The toddler's tiny fingers gripped the edge of her crib, her brown eyes, so much like her mother's, fixed on Lydia with an understanding beyond her years. She didn't cry. She didn't understand where her mother was going or why. But somehow, on some primal level, she knew her mother was leaving. Her small body tensed as if preparing for the absence, for the hunger and fear that would follow. Lydia's phone buzzed. The driver was outside. She checked her lipstick in the reflection of the hallway mirror, adjusted her jacket, made sure she looked good. Perfect. Desirable. Worth choosing. She didn't say goodbye. Didn't turn to look at her daughter one last time. Didn't check if there was enough food or if the water in the sippy cup might last more than a day. Didn't make sure the nightlight had fresh batteries or that the apartment was a safe temperature. Lydia stepped outside, pulled the door shut, heard the lock click into place. And then she walked away, her footsteps quick and light, unburdened. She didn't look back. Not even once. Behind that locked door, Zoe stood in her crib, still watching the space where her mother had been. Outside, a car engine started. Tires moved over asphalt. A mother left for what she thought would be a weekend getaway. It would be 8 days before anyone opened that door again. 8 days of silence, of hunger, of abandonment. 8 days too long for a 2-year-old left entirely alone. 8 days that would end everything. February 3rd, 2023, Day 1. Lydia stepped out of the rideshare with a flutter in her chest. This wasn't the luxury high-rise Elijah's messages had painted. Just a roadside hotel with flickering signs and water stains on the lobby ceiling. Not the paradise she had abandoned her child for. But when Elijah appeared, his smile erased her doubts. He was here. He wanted her. She was chosen. The room was small, the bed sagging in the middle. Elijah covered it with fake rose petals from the dollar store. The champagne was cheap sparkling wine in plastic cups. But his eyes when he looked at her, hungry, admiring, made it feel like luxury. That night her phone buzzed, Zoe doctor appointment, 10 a.m. For a heartbeat, guilt pierced through her haze of desire. A child alone, calling for a mother who wouldn't answer. She silenced the phone, turned it face down. "Everything okay?" Elijah asked, fingers tracing her bare shoulder. "Perfect," Lydia whispered, choosing the fantasy over reality. Meanwhile, in Ohio, Zoe awakened to emptiness. Her cries for mama bounced off empty walls, returned to her unanswered. Hunger gnawed, thirst burned, her soiled diaper cold against raw skin. She pulled herself up in her crib, tiny fingers gripping the rails, eyes fixed on a door that wouldn't open. She cried until her voice broke, until her throat was raw. until even screaming brought no relief. February 4th, 2023, Day 2. Lydia danced under colored lights in a bar that wasn't exclusive, wasn't special, just cheap drinks and a sticky floor. But Elijah's arm stayed wrapped around her waist, his lips close to her ear. "My special girl," he called her, and Lydia felt reborn. She posed for selfies, filtered the dingy background into something glamorous. "Living my best life," she captioned, desperate to believe it. By day 2, she didn't think of Zoe at all. In the apartment, Zoe had tumbled from her crib, a desperate, dangerous fall that left a purple bruise blooming on her forehead but gave her freedom to search. She crawled through rooms grown strange in her mother's absence, looking for food, for comfort, for explanation. The crackers and snacks remained on the counter, just out of reach. Her sippy cup lay on its side, precious liquid soaked into the carpet. She tried to lick moisture from the fibers, the taste of dust and carpet cleaner mixing with the faint sweetness of juice. Her diaper hung heavy, rash burning with each movement. Still, she kept searching, kept hoping, kept waiting for the sound of keys in the lock, for familiar arms to scoop her up and make the world right again. February 5th, 2023, Day 3. "We'll go shopping tomorrow," Elijah promised, though they both knew his credit cards were maxed out. "Next time we'll do the 5-star treatment." Lydia nodded, smiled, chose to believe because believing was easier than facing what she'd done. The walls of the hotel room seemed to close in when Elijah left for business meetings that stretched for hours. Lydia watched cable TV, scrolled social media, posted more carefully composed photos. Each like, each comment validated her choice, allowed her to forget what she had left behind. A neighbor paused outside apartment 407, listening to cries that had transformed from normal baby sounds to something desperate, something primal. Mrs. Wilson raised her hand to knock, then lowered it. Not her business. Not her problem. The cries stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was worse than the screaming had been. Inside, Zoe had collapsed on the living room floor, her small body curled tight against the cold, against the hunger, against the abandonment. Her lips cracked from dehydration, her diaper unchanged for days. The apartment grew dark, then light again, time passing in a blur of misery without relief. February 6th, 2023, Day 4. "We could go to Miami next," Elijah whispered against Lydia's neck. "I've got connections there. Big money." Lydia imagined beaches, nightclubs, a life so far removed from diapers and daycare that it might as well be another universe. She imagined herself transformed, not a mother who abandoned her child, but someone worthy of luxury, of attention, of love. February 7th, 2023, Day 5. By Day 5, Zoe wasn't crying anymore. The silence in apartment 407 was complete, broken only by the occasional footsteps passing in the hallway, neighbors living their lives unaware of the tragedy unfolding behind the locked door. Zoe lay near the front door, as if she had been trying to reach it when her strength finally gave out. Her lips were blue-tinged, her eyes sunken, her body still except for the shallow rise and fall of her chest. The will to cry, to fight, to hope had drained away hour by hour, leaving behind only the faintest pulse of life. In Cleveland, doubt seeped into Lydia's fantasy. Elijah's stories didn't add up. His business associates never materialized. The money he flashed, a roll of bills he kept in his pocket, seemed to shrink daily. But Lydia clung to the fantasy because the alternative was too terrible to face. If this wasn't real, then what had she done? What had she sacrificed? Who had she abandoned? February 8th, 2023, Day 6. Mr. Ramirez from apartment 406 noticed the smell first. Just a hint of something wrong when he passed by 407. He mentioned it to his wife, who suggested calling management. Tomorrow, they decided. If it still smells tomorrow. Inside the apartment, time had lost all meaning for Zoe. Her small body, designed to fight, to survive, was losing its battle against neglect. The apartment grew cold at night, stifling during the day. The silence complete, no crying, no movement, just the imperceptible slowing of a child's heartbeat. 2 more days would pass before someone finally opened that door. 2 more days of Lydia pretending nothing was wrong. 2 more days of neighbors ignoring their instincts. 2 more days too long for a child abandoned by the one person who should have protected her above all else. February 10, 2023, 9:15 a.m. Marcus Wheeler had been the maintenance man at Oakwood Apartments for 8 years. He'd seen it all: water damage, electrical fires, pest infestations. He thought nothing could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. The call came from the building manager first thing that morning. Complaints about a smell from 407. Probably garbage left too long. Can you check it out? Marcus nodded, though no one could see him through the phone. On my way. He knew 407. The young mother with the little girl. Quiet, kept to themselves. Rent sometimes late but always paid eventually. He'd fixed their leaky faucet last month. Noticed the little one watching him with solemn eyes from her high chair. She hadn't cried or fussed, just watched, thumb in mouth, a stuffed rabbit clutched to her chest. The smell hit him halfway down the hall. Not garbage. Something else. Something worse. His stomach tightened as he approached the door. The odor intensified, sickly sweet, unmistakable to anyone who had ever encountered it before. Death has a smell all its own. He knocked anyway. Protocol. Maintenance. Anyone home? Silence. He knocked again, louder. Ms. Mercer? Everything okay in there? Nothing. Marcus called the manager. I think we need to go in. Something's not right. A decision was made. Emergency entry authorized. The master key slid into the lock, turned with a click that seemed too ordinary for what was about to be discovered. The door opened. The stench hit first, a wall of putrid air that made Marcus stagger backward, flying up to cover his nose and mouth. Behind him, Mrs. Wilson from 408 had stepped into the hallway, curious about the commotion. "Oh God," she whispered. "I heard crying. Days ago. I heard crying and I didn't." Her voice broke. "I didn't do anything." Marcus steadied himself, took a shallow breath through his mouth, and stepped inside. The apartment was dim, curtains drawn against the morning light. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust. The living room looked normal at first glance. A couch with faded cushions. A coffee table with old magazines. A TV in the corner. But then he noticed the details. Toys scattered across the floor, a tiny pink shoe near the couch, a sippy cup on its side, the carpet beneath it stained and stiff. Then he saw her. A small body curled up on the floor near the front door. Motionless. Still. Too still. Her diaper, visibly soiled, had clearly been unchanged for days. Her skin, once plump with toddler softness, now stretched tight over tiny bones. Her lips, parched and cracked, had a bluish tint. "Hello." Marcus called softly, though he already knew there would be no answer. "Little one." He approached slowly, as if sudden movement might somehow make this worse than it already was. He knelt beside the child. In the dim light, she almost looked like she could be sleeping, if not for the unnatural stillness, the absence of the gentle rise and fall of breathing. Marcus reached out, his large, calloused hand trembling slightly. He pressed 2 fingers gently against her small wrist, searching for a pulse he already knew wouldn't be there. Silence. No one spoke. No one moved. Because at that moment, they knew. Behind him, Mrs. Wilson began to sob, great heaving cries that seemed to fill the apartment, to give voice to the grief that hung in the air like a physical presence. Marcus stood on legs that suddenly felt too weak to support him. He pulled out his phone, dialed 911, his voice mechanical as he reported what he had found. The words felt inadequate, wrong. How do you explain that a child had died alone, abandoned, while life continued around her? How do you put into words the horror of a tiny body curled toward a door that never opened? The dispatcher asked questions he answered automatically. Yes, the child was unresponsive. No, no signs of breathing. No, no adults present. No, he didn't know how long the child had been alone. But he knew enough. The smell told its own story. The empty bottles, the desperate crawl marks in spilled juice on the floor, the torn open cereal box with pieces scattered like evidence of a last, failed attempt to survive. Within minutes, the apartment complex came alive with activity. Police cars, their lights spinning silent red and blue patterns across the building's facade. Paramedics rushing in with equipment, their urgency a formality. The medical examiner, face grim as he knelt where Marcus had knelt. Neighbors gathered in the hallway, in the parking lot, voices hushed, faces shocked. "I saw the mother leave last week," someone said. "With a suitcase." "I heard crying," Mrs. Wilson repeated, her face ashen. "I heard crying and I did nothing." The police took statements, asked questions. When was the last time anyone had seen Lydia Mercer? Had anyone noticed visitors, babysitters, family members? Had anyone heard the child in distress? As the small body was finally, carefully, removed from the apartment, too late for an ambulance, just a silent journey to the medical examiner's office, the truth settled over everyone present like a shroud. A child had died alone, abandoned by the one person she should have been able to trust above all others. While her mother danced in bars and took selfies hundreds of miles away, Zoe Mercer had fought for her life and lost, her last view the underside of a door that never opened. Detective Sarah Reeves had seen countless horror in 15 years working child crimes. But the photos from apartment 407 broke through her armor. A tiny body curled toward a door that never opened, a sippy cup drained dry, desperate finger marks in spilled food. It took less than 2 hours to trace Lydia Mercer. Her digital footprint was careless: flight confirmations, hotel bookings, credit card transactions. No attempt to hide. The Cleveland hotel door burst open under the force of a police battering ram. Officers stormed in, weapons drawn. Lydia sat frozen on the bed, eyes wide. Elijah tried to bolt but was tackled to the floor, his protests silenced by handcuffs. Lydia barely resisted as cuffs encircled her wrists. There was a disconnect in her expression, as if she were watching this happen to someone else. Only when Detective Reeves stepped in front of her did something flicker in her eyes. Recognition of what must have happened. "My daughter," she whispered, voice cracking. "I need to check on my daughter." Detective Reeves' face was stone, her voice ice. "You left a 2-year-old alone for 8 days. Lydia's body folded in on itself, a keening sound rising from deep inside. Not grief, not yet. Something more primal. The sound of a reality too terrible to process crashing through her carefully built delusion. June 5, 2023, Trial Day 1. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled. Lydia sat at the defense table, thinner now, hollow-eyed, her prison jumpsuit hanging loose. She didn't look up as the charges were read. First-degree murder. Child endangerment. Criminal neglect. The prosecutor, Elena Martinez, approached the jury. This was not a mistake. This was a choice. A series of choices, made day after day for 8 days. On the courtroom screens, evidence appeared. Lydia's selfies in bars. Timestamp showing 5 days after she left Zoe alone. A video of her dancing, laughing, arms wrapped around Elijah's neck. Credit card receipts for drinks, for clothes, for a silver bracelet bought on day 6. She had a phone, Martinez continued. She had money for a cab. She had every opportunity to go back, to call someone, to save her child. Instead, she chose this. A photo of Lydia smiling into the camera, cocktail in hand. The date stamp, February 9th. The day before Zoe was found. Lydia's defense painted a different picture. A woman struggling with undiagnosed depression. A victim herself of childhood neglect. A person manipulated by a skilled con man. She suffered depression. She made a terrible decision, her attorney implored. But she never intended for her child to die. But the evidence was overwhelming, the timeline damning. Day after day of choices leading further away from a locked apartment where a child slowly died. Elijah testified against her, claiming he never knew she had a child. Whether this was true or another manipulation didn't matter. The damage was done. June 12, 2023, final day. The prosecutor's closing argument cut through the courtroom like a blade. Depression doesn't make you party while your baby is starving. Depression doesn't make you pose for selfies while your child is dying of thirst. Depression doesn't stop you from making a single phone call that could have saved her life. Martinez held up the last photo of Zoe alive, a solemn-eyed toddler clutching a stuffed rabbit. Zoe Mercer deserved a mother who put her needs first. Instead, she got Lydia Mercer, a woman who locked a door, walked away, and never looked back. The jury deliberated for just 4 hours. Their verdict: guilty on all counts. As the judge sentenced Lydia to life in prison without possibility of parole, she finally broke, heaving sobs torn from somewhere primal and deep. Whether she wept for Zoe or for herself, no one could say. Elijah received 15 years for fraud, identity theft, and accessory after the fact. His youth, his cooperation, his claims of ignorance about the child, all factored into a sentence that seemed insufficient. As Lydia was led away in shackles, a reporter asked how she felt about the verdict. She stopped, turned slowly. The hollow-eyed mask she'd worn throughout the trial cracked open. "I can still hear her calling for me," she whispered. "Every night in my cell. Every moment I'm awake. My baby, calling for me. And I just keep walking away." Who was Lydia Mercer? Really? A woman destroyed by a childhood without love, desperately seeking connection wherever she could find it? Or someone who always ran from responsibility, who valued her own desires above even the life of her child? Perhaps she was both, a victim of her past and the architect of a tragedy that could have been prevented at any point during those 8 fatal days. One phone call. One moment of maternal instinct breaking through the fog of self-absorption. One choice different from the hundreds she made that led away from that locked apartment door. The tragedy of Zoe Mercer isn't just that she died alone, abandoned by the one person biologically programmed to protect her. It's that her death was entirely preventable, not just by her mother, but by a community that heard cries and looked away, by a system that failed to recognize a child at risk, by a society that often chooses not to get involved. How many children suffer like Zoe right now? How many cry behind closed doors while neighbors hesitate, while family members suspect but don't act, while we collectively tell ourselves that it's not our business, not our problem? The signs are always there if we're willing to see them. The sudden absence, the cries that go on too long, the silence that follows that is somehow worse than the screaming. Lydia Mercer will spend the rest of her life in prison, but she's not the only one who failed Zoe. In small ways, in moments of hesitation and uncertainty, we all did. The question remains: next time, will we act differently? Or will we, like Lydia, choose to walk away?